Okay. Hello, everyone, to our panel, Sustainable Mobility, an online panel discussion. Thank you for joining. Today, we will discuss the EU regulation setting CO2 emission performance standards for new passenger cars and for new light commercial vehicles. It's a long name, but it's actually a very interesting topic, one that affects all of us. Mobility is central to our lives, and making sure that we green it and we make it more sustainable will be central to making sure that we can stay in line with the Paris Agreement. It will be a major part of the European Green Deal, and it will probably also play a very important role in the recovery that the EU and the member states are now planning post-COVID. We're very lucky today to have so many high-level, super interesting and very involved speakers in this and for this topic to talk about the impact on society, industry, and the environment of this regulation and the wider issue of sustainable mobility. To keep things dynamic, I will let each of them introduce themselves to you. We will go around the four speakers, and I want to ask you, just in very short, in 2 sentences, who are you and what is your connection to this regulation? Peter, you can start.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Peter. I'm actually a former MU Strasbourg organizer, so hello first to everyone out there who actually knows me. But now I'm a Brussels energy geek, and I work for the association representing the utility industry in Europe, so the electricity sector, from power generation to distribution and all the services in between, markets as well. And I work on electric mobility. So for our sector, this is a piece of legislation that matters a lot because it really impacts and it sets the pace with which we electrify transport.
Thanks. Birgitte.
Hello, I'm Birgitte Keulen. I work for the European Investment Bank. For those of you who don't know this, it's the lending arm of the EU. We're a pretty big bank. We're the largest multilateral investment bank investor. We are a public bank, so we don't only interested in getting the money back, but also that we are contributing to public policy goals. The EIB has announced that we're stepping up our ambitions on climate, trying to become the EIB, the EU climate bank. And with the volumes we do, we think we should be helping to make the transition into cleaner mobility because it's needed.
It definitely is. Thank you. Mitja.
Hi guys, so my name is Mitja. I'm representing the German Automotive Association, which is short VDA, and we have member companies, the manufacturers of cars, of trucks, of light commercial vehicles, as well as suppliers and manufacturers of buses, trucks, and trailers in our membership. And in total, like more than 600 companies representing 800,000 jobs in Germany. But of course, we are also European industry. So our manufacturers produce in 15 countries, etc. And why I'm here, I think the CO2 fleet regulation is the most important regulation when it comes to how much cost it for the automotive manufacturers. And so it's very important. And I was following the regulation since I joined the office here in Brussels, which I'm heading now.
Thank you. And last but not least, Sara.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Sara Sloman. I work for Foote Anstey, which is a law firm in Bristol in England. We are working together with lots of manufacturers and EVSEs and CPOs, so charge point operators, to see how we can simplify and speed up the process of electrification here in the UK. And personally, I look very regularly to legislation and regulation like this to see what we can learn back in the UK and potentially even share what we've done that may have not quite met your cities just yet too. So this is very much a two-way street. I like to connect people together. We work with investors, we work with energy companies, and our entire aim is to aid the decarbonisation of transport. So I'm very excited today to delve deeper into this legislation and pull out the best bits and debate a bit and see where we end up at the end of the hour.
That sounds great. And we'll get started right away. Everyone who's watching now, please feel free to add your questions to the comments on YouTube, and they'll be transferred to me, and I will transfer them to the speakers, because we do want a lot of involvement. MUS is all about interaction, and we want you to interact with the speakers. But for now, we will go through a lightning round, a very short round to get us going with short questions and hopefully short answers. And the first one will be, do you drive an electric car, Peter?
I sometimes rent one, but usually in the city I cycle or I take the public transport. I don't own one.
Great. Birgitte?
I do have an electric car. I also cycle walk most of my but I live in Luxembourg. Electric car. We have no free extender because it's all on. But if I can choose, I take the electric train.
Okay, I didn't understand all of it. You were a bit scrambled in the middle, so I hope the connection will not get worse from here. But I heard you do drive an electric car, and otherwise you take the train. I hope that's correct. Okay, while Birgitte maybe still figures out her connection, we'll move on to Mitja.
Yeah, well, I don't drive an electric car because I don't drive a car at all. I live in Brussels city center, so there's no need for me to drive a car.
That makes sense. Sara?
We are a nation of car drivers here in the UK, and the majority are not electric. My car is electric, but just like that, I try to make sure I walk, run, cycle, car share, or use public transport, because that's the way to go.
Great. So I think we have a round of people who know what sustainable mobility is about. Next question, hybrid, electric, or hydrogen? Where are things headed in your opinion? Peter?
Can you guess by the name of the association I represent?
I think that can tell us something, yeah. Birgitte, if you're there.
I think my hunch is as good as yours. Current state of play seems to be full battery electric and hybrids. I don't think it will be hydrogen for cars. But no, battery costs are still high. And for other vehicles like trucks and buses and planes and trains, we might need other solutions as well.
Mitja?
I think the short answer would be we don't know. No one knows, because we can't predict the future, and we might be able to see some trends, but there will be different. It's likely that we will have different powertrains for different modes of transportation. So maybe it's a different kind of powertrain, maybe electric in the city in the future. Maybe it will be hydrogen or another combustion engine for long haul trucks. So can't say now.
Okay, more differentiated picture. And Sara?
I really feel it's whatever the right tool is for the job. So for small passenger cars, electric seems great. For larger, long haul, heavy duty stuff, I think hydrogen is great. But ultimately, as we are all in agreement here, it's best to have less cars. And if we simply swap every single internal combustion engine for an electric one, I'm afraid we've failed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another quick question, and now Birgitte has turned off her camera to see if that helps the connection, but we will still hear her lovely voice, so that's okay. Are the EU's current emission performance standards for cars too low, too high, or just right? Peter?
I think they've been quite right in the sense that they were able to definitely push the market to transform. And what we see right now, especially with the deadline looming for OEMs to reach their targets, it's clear that the push for electric is making sense. So that would be my answer quite shortly.
Thanks. Birgitte?
Based on what? For short term, long term, for the manufacturers, for those who have already invested in EV, the ones that have not, for employment in the automotive sector, for people with respiratory or cardiovascular diseases, for the planet? You tell me, on what basis should we be judging this? Because that's what we're talking about. It's a difficult balance. And I think this is what we have landed at the EU to try to balance the different parts.
Yeah, yes. Mitja?
I can only agree to what Brigitte said, and might add that they are certainly very ambitious, those CO2 performance standards, the 95 gram for 2020, 21, as well as the targets for 2025 and 2030. So for the manufacturers who are the ones who have to fulfill and deliver, they're very ambitious, but achievable.
I echo that. That is really hard, and it depends who you're talking to. We talk a lot about carrot and stick in the UK. It seems to be constant bashing all the time, and we really feel there needs to be a lot more incentive rather than just constant punishment. So I'm hoping that with these very strict and excellently ambitious targets, as Brigitte said, we can look towards a future where everybody is satisfied and everybody can live healthily.
Okay, another quick question. Do we need an EU-wide ban of combustion engine cars in the next decade, so until 2030, which a lot of countries are already planning? And maybe more interestingly, will we see one? Peter?
Yeah, no, it's a very provocative question indeed, and gets a lot of people going. What I want to share here is that we don't need a ban for technology. I think that the market itself will prove what makes sense to invest in, especially now with this health crisis. We see what technologies are being more successful, more future-proof, and which are less so. And I'm talking from the perspective of the electricity industry and the energy sector at large.
Okay, Brigitte? You might be muted. We don't hear you.
I was trying to unmute, but it's remuting me. I don't know. I think it helps to see by what time we think something should be happening. But if you look at the corollary of the electricity sector, there actually the ETS price is now closing down coal power plants without banning them. So maybe, as Peter says, we don't need them. It might still be that some countries decide to put one in place.
Mitja?
I don't think banning a technology is the right way to the right approach at all. I agree. I think in the end, the market will decide what's most efficient and most cost efficient and best for the climate and for consumers. I also don't think that it will be possible in a single market for one country to just ban the specific technology. So no country, to my knowledge, no country or no government has actually put it into law. They scratched some plans about it, but once they will put it into law, then the Commission will have to decide whether this is in line or complying with EU law or not. Having said that, I don't think banning this like combustion engine is efficient because it depends very much on the actual carrier of energy that you use. If you use fuel that would be CO2 neutral, why would you want to ban the combustion engine if you can help the climate?
Yeah. Okay. Sara?
We are heading towards a ban, and actually when the ban was discussed and then followed up with clean air zones or strategies within cities to ensure that there was more to it than just the CO2, it's actually the particulates and human health became part of the debate. We noticed that suddenly there was a consumer interest that just wasn't there before, and so in electric cars and alternative fuel vehicles. So we find the ban has been very useful to trigger something and to do a kickstart to a motion.
Yeah, so we do have different opinions on the panel. I would say everyone has their own viewpoint, and I think that's great. I'm ready for a really good discussion. One last quick question, and if you can really just answer it with only one sentence. I know it's hard, but it's just supposed to give us an impulse of what we will talk about in the next hour. What one thing would you change about the regulation if you could? Peter?
A stronger requirement for manufacturers to sell plug-in vehicles, plug-in electric vehicles, if they're also reaping the benefits from the so-called bonus malus, the ZLEV mandate, or the necessity to sell zero and low emission vehicles.
Birgitte?
I would not change anything anymore because it's very important that things stay stable, at least in the shorter run, because people have already decided, the manufacturers have decided how they do their investment strategies. So we should not be tinkering in the short run anymore.
Okay. Mitya?
Yeah, I think what Brigitte said is also right. But I think in adding a bit more of conditionality to the regulation. So if we have an uptake of XY percentage in electromobility in the market by 2025, then we can adjust the CO2 target.
Okay. Sara?
I'd definitely like to see some incentives. I really feel like without incentives, nothing ends up changing. But I do agree with everybody that changing it now, it's already been written and rewritten so many times that we do need to just progress now.
That does make a lot of sense. And still, the Commission is, of course, looking at reviewing the legislation and making it more strict in the next years. But we'll get to that in a minute. So for now, I want to remind our audience and our listeners that you can definitely add your questions in the comments, and then we will ask them here for the panel. While we wait, we will go through specific questions for each of you. So, and I've shared them with you before, so I hope you had the chance to prepare a bit. And I'd ask you to, again, to keep it to 3 minutes. We will start with Peter. Your question is, the Commission is betting on electric cars to make mobility more sustainable, although critics argue that they can be just as bad for the environment as combustion engine cars. Why force a switch from fossil fuels to electricity? And shouldn't the energy system be brought to net zero first?
Yeah, so a few points here. I'll first start with the last point you raised about bringing the energy system to net zero. So this is something that we as a sector have already pledged towards. Together with our members, we have developed several modeling scenarios where we see how that happens. And we see that by 2045, so that's in 25 years, all the electricity that's produced in Europe will be decarbonized, which means renewables, a lot of hydropower, a lot of wind, offshore wind, especially solar, and some nuclear. So that's part of the solution that we see for a decarbonized power sector. And even science shows that right now the grid is decreasing in terms of the average CO2 intensity of the electricity supply. Compared to 2018, 2019 saw a 12% decrease of the electricity carbon intensity, which is one of the biggest reductions at year-on-year basis. And together with this, we also see that their efficiency in battery production. So when we all look into that picture, EVs are actually performing better across Europe. Maybe there's some exceptions like perhaps Poland or Estonia, which have really high carbon intensity at all times. And then as an aside, I think also what we see right now with the current health crisis is a postcard from the future. And I'm talking about the bright signal in terms of the electricity sector. Obviously, everything else really is, yeah, it's quite bad. But what we see in our sector is that in April, we had about 40% of all electricity coming from renewables. And the system was able to integrate it. That's across Europe. We also saw that EVs outperform combustion engine cars in terms of sales. So probably this is, again, the message I sent earlier. Clean tech has a future, and it has to receive its support. Because apart from achieving climate goals, we need to consider the competitiveness of our industries, the European industries. Because you have other industries such as the Chinese one that are also producing cars, and they're also coming to the EU markets possibly very soon. So again, to reiterate, also the more you electrify transport, the more you create the demand for renewables. And in our modeling, that's what one thing we see. We see increased demand also because of electrifying sectors like transport, but also buildings and heavy industries like cement, steel. So if I have a graph to show, I can definitely show you. You see how throughout the years, the supply of electricity is decarbonizing. And at the same time, you have electric cars coming in the market. So it really doesn't make sense to wait until the whole electricity supply is decarbonized and then introduce electric vehicles. They're part of the same coin. They're two sides of the same coin, and they reinforce each other.
Okay, thank you. That's a balanced picture for sure. Next, we'll go to Birgitte, and I have a special question for you because you're coming from the banking sector, of course, so it will be about money. And there's a lot of talk about how much money is needed to green the European economy and get to net zero by 2050. And of course, everyone's throwing around different numbers, but recently, this week, I saw an estimation by Agora Energiewende, a German think tank, and they estimated that there's an 840 billion euro funding gap at the moment for the next years to get transport to be more sustainable. So where do you think all that money will come from? Because in the recovery fund proposal and even in the multi-annual financial framework proposal, there's not that much money available for transport.
Thanks. I looked up yesterday the report, and I tried to find out where the numbers came from. But it was hard to find, really, to see where the 840 came from. It seems to be not an investment gap, but investment needs for the period of 2021-2027. And that seems a lot of money. I don't have it in my personal bank account. Maybe the bank could get in the order of magnitude on our balance sheets. But if we compare this with car sales, volumes in 2019, there were around 50 million cars being sold in the EU. Very quick calculation. If we would translate that into investments, let's assume a very quite low price of 10,000 euros per car. That gives me already that we as consumers, all of us, we invest 150 billion euros a year for new cars alone. If we then also look at the EU energy imports, which average about 25 billion per month, which is 300 billion per year, then you can see actually we're already investing quite a bit in our energy and transport systems every year, and we're not talking about 5 years. Then that whole number seems more doable. So it's also a lot about spending our money differently. And that is in line with what the Paris Agreement asks us to do, to align our financial streams. Of course, some types of investments will require more upfront. So, for instance, an electric car is more expensive to buy than a combustion engine car. But TCO-wise, and total cost of ownership, you gain that back again if you use the car sufficiently often. So maybe it's also not just funding gaps, but also coming up with financing solutions and other nudges that direct all the financial streams in the right direction. And then in the long run, it will pay for itself. Is that answering your question?
Yes, it's picking up a lot of different and very important points. Thank you. And I think we'll get to that a bit more later. But I'll move to the specific question for Mitja, and it's a mean one maybe. But cars are loud and dangerous and pollute our air, and they take up lots of space in our city centers. But they're still the main mode of transport for many people. So should the EU see this green transition of transport as a chance to transform mobility more deeply? And does everyone really need to own a car?
So let me start with the last bit of the question. I don't own a car, so apparently not everyone needs to own a car. Maybe at some point I will, but this is also, so first of all, we do see a change in consumer behavior. There might be, there are people who are not, especially younger people who are not in need for a car at the moment. They're living in the city center in urban areas, so close to where they work, and where their hipster cafe is, they don't need it. They're they're getting around with car sharing, with public transport, with bikes, and they're quite happy with it. But we should not only apply this urban city elite perspective on the mode of transport we use, especially in first of all, not all over Europe the public transport is as good and developed as it is in London or in Berlin city. Second, many people have to commute into the from rural areas into the city to get to their jobs, and the public transport is not as good as it should be if we wanted to take everyone into the trains. Then most recently there was a big health crisis going on in Europe, which also shows that maybe some people enjoy not being stuck into a London underground with tons of people, maybe like 10 centimeters away from each other. So this might also be an incentive to, or an argument for having your own car, because you feel more safe, as long as we have no vessels in. Just on this last bit. Then on the first bit of the question, I think you said cars are loud, which is, I think, not true. Electric cars are pretty not loud. I don't think they make any noise at all, which is nice in cities. If you live in at like a very busy street and imagine all cars would be electric, there would be no more noise pollution for you. On the other hand, cars without noise might also pose some kind of a danger in the streets. When you cross a street and you don't pay attention, you might not hear the car passing by. Also an issue. Then dangerous, yes. Everyone who is acting in traffic should take care of himself and of other people around. This is very clear. And I think when we look at, this is a different regulation, the general safety regulation, which was just adopted last year, which will also add a lot of mandatory technologies for safety into cars. And then we also look at connectivity, connected automated driving, which will also help to make transport more safety. Safety is a very big issue. It's very important. Then you said, I think, polluting. There, I think we have two issues. One is the CO2 regulation, which is greenhouse gas emissions, and the other one is pollutants, which affects your health. CO2 does not affect your health. So that these are two different kinds of emissions that we have to take into account here. And also, they are battery electric cars. They are not polluting anything. And similar with cars driven by hydrogen are not polluting a lot. So it depends very much on the detail that you look here. And yes, the cars take space in the city, but there are manufacturers, for instance, BMW who never said, like they often say, okay, we don't mind if we have a car-free city center in Munich, which is fine. I think what you should do, first of all, it's important to not to make sure that there's no fragmentation in the European Union when you, for instance, talk about driving bans. And second and last point is that you make it smart in cities, make the traffic smart, look what possibilities you have without banning anyone from the city. So make traffic lights more smooth, etc.
All right, we got a lot of pro arguments for keeping cars as part of mobility. Sara, so I have a very recent case for you, which just this week a French court gave the government a 6-month ultimatum to stop exceeding pollution limits, or else face very hefty fines. So in light of that, and lots of things like that are happening around Europe, do you think it will be enough to implement this regulation that we're talking about? Or is much more legislative action needed to clean up the air in our cities? If yes, which will probably be your answer, what do you think still needs to be regulated?
Well, I mean, first of all, listening to you all talk about your experiences across Europe, I can't decide if I'm happy or sad that everybody everywhere is experiencing the same problem. So the banning of vehicles just isn't possible unless there's excellent systems in place to get people from A to B. It really is as simple as that. And so this is about the French state being scolded by the judges for failing to properly tackle the air pollution, and this 6-month ultimatum to clean up, or millions of euros. It wasn't exactly small change. It was a lot of euros every 6 months. And I think that sort of incremental damage will be very helpful to push things forward. And policy and legislation is only as good as the next threat. So you can put something in place, but if you're not going to follow it up and you're not going to provide adequate strategy to get you to the target that has been set, then it's almost unfair. So I always want to see legislation and policy coming forward that takes into account the how as well as the why. And I think often that can be overlooked slightly. So there's lots of really good examples out there where a really solid opportunity has presented itself through things like policy and legislation. I was hearing just yesterday from Mark Dickens, who's Group Renault's fleet manager for the whole of Europe. Now, he was describing what they've been doing with Ziti, which is the car club that you have in Paris, and also, is it Milan? But either way, they've put Madrid, 725 vehicles are now in the city centre in Madrid, which is car sharing alone, and 500 in Paris. So the idea is you free up road space, you make sure that cars are present within the city, but they're not your default go-to. It opens up the transport hierarchy even further. So you're forced to think about your journey rather than defaulting straight into a vehicle. So car clubs are fantastic. Micromobility is a fantastic way to support legislation like this, so making sure that people can hire or rent small micro scooters and e-bikes, and just really thinking carefully about who your consumer actually is and building a city around that, rather than trying to shoehorn lots of people into a very tight space and wonder why the roads are always congested all the time.
I think there were some really good ideas among them, and some are being pursued already, but obviously we need probably more action in many areas.
Definitely.
Yeah, and yet now I would open the floor to everyone, so all of you, the panelists, can pitch in whenever I ask a question. And I will start with a point that also Mitya raised, so that we mentioned, but we can maybe go into it a bit more in detail, which is that there is a need for infrastructure, charging infrastructure, if we're going to go electric in terms of mobility, and especially in rural areas. So I'm from a small town, and I don't know of any charging stations there. How is that going to go where public transport is sparse? Even in some cities in Europe, it's not as well provided as in cities, as you said, Mitya. And the individual mobility is so important. This is unlikely to change without massive government investments. So is it socially sustainable to go to e-mobility? What are we going to do about these issues? And I see that Sara already has an answer.
I spend so much of my life discussing this because I too live rurally and work in an urban environment 20 miles away. So with regards to the first part of the question, with the infrastructure, build it and they will come, or is it lead a horse to water, you can't make a drink? So we need to think about how to encourage people to actually use the infrastructure. But one thing's for sure, they're not going to use it if it's not there. So it is fantastic to see government investment. It is fantastic to see educational programs. It is fantastic to see user behavior evolve. So the second you try an electric car, you will learn that they are silent at first, but of course then once it's up to speed, then the road noise is exactly the same. So some of the safety concerns are being ruled out on that ground. And of course the cars now feature extra noise. So there's many ways that you can change the user experience. And I think that's what's going to happen with the rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but it does need investment. And the payback is very long, and Brigitte is going to tell us more about that. But for now, the message is build it and they will come eventually, but not without holding hands, not without offering some carrots instead of constant sticks. And we need to be really innovative, really think about our offer, and perhaps even consider the way that we could use our cities in a circular fashion. So you come to the edge and then you change your travel mode. You don't have to do an A to B on one mode. But we've been trying to do it for decades, and each year we see something new come forward. So I'm really, really excited. The first time in 15 years in this profession, I can genuinely say I can see it happening.
Well, that gives me a lot of hope. That's nice to hear. So Brigitte, maybe you do want to say something about this, because it is about how we invest.
Yes, it is about how we invest. But first, I want to start with something. electric car, you know, you can also charge it with your plug at home. So yes, you may live in a rural area, but you can charge it at home. So if you live in a rural area, you probably have access to a plug. It's actually in the cities that it's more difficult because, for instance, I live in an apartment. I cannot charge at home. I need a charging point. But you in a rural area, you can charge at home. So get that out first out of out of it. Then the second thing is, have you looked up where the charging points are in your neighborhood? For instance, you can, the European Union has paid for a lovely website called the European Alternative Fuels Observatory. And you can see all over Europe, there are already charging stations. So you may need to plan your trip better, which I do because my battery only allows me to travel for 200 kilometers electric. So I have to plan it, but it's possible. Then going back to the investment needs, yes, there are investment needs, and we do need to help to build up the network, but we're already doing that. Together with the Commission, we have developed instruments to overcome the uncertainty of the market. So we have, for instance, already financed Greenwage, which is building charging stations across Slovakia and Poland, not known for the high shares of electric mobility. So this is possible. And of course, yes, there will be investment needs also in the form of grants, but a lot of can also be solved with more financial instruments, but also with giving certainty that the vehicles will come. Because if that can go conjointly, then it will happen. Sometimes for the panel discussion, it's nice to say, do we need this or this? No, we needed both. I think somebody else wants to react as well.
I'll give the floor to Mitja, and then I do have a connected question already for Peter, so you should get ready. But for now, Mitja, please go ahead.
Yes, I do believe we need both. I don't think that we need only electric mobility, but this should be our main focus at the moment. I think this is one of the big flaws of the CO2 regulation, is that there's no no conditional link between the uptake of electric cars and the building up of infrastructure for charging. So we do have this hand and neck problem, and we also have an irrational fear from on the side of consumers that they think like, this is a new kind of vehicle, new kind of powertrain. I'm not sure if it fulfills my need for driving for the needed distance I'd like to drive, and also I don't know if there's enough charging infrastructure around. Then also, if I live in a city center or in an apartment, I might not have my own garage where I can charge my car. So this is important issues, and then the CO2 regulation needs to be matters for the whole European Union, not only for Germany or for Netherlands, France, or the UK. It was a regulation for the whole EU. So all the cars, the standards have to be met for the whole EU, which means that we all need infrastructure not only in some member states and not in some areas, but all over Europe. And at the moment, I think three-quarters of the charging infrastructure is basically based in 4 European countries, and one of them was the UK, which is basically out of the club, and then Netherlands, Germany, and I think France. And of course, there needs to be money invested to build up infrastructure somewhere else.
And I'd like to follow that with just one quick statement before we move on to Peter. It's just that socially, it's often the way that to embrace new technology, if you're not financially affluent and able to access that, then you will be penalized. If you have a 10-year-old polluting vehicle, then you'll either have to scrap it altogether and therefore not get access to the employment that you need, or you will be fined every time you go anywhere near a clean air zone. So I do want to see some of those medium to small range battery electric cars coming forward, and the necessary public infrastructure around and about the place to support them, whether that's destination charging at their work or some kind of agile system where you can park at a friend's house whilst you're in the city or whatever. But yeah, so it's not always about charging at home. It's often about, as you say, charging on the go, charging on the hoof. And we haven't even talked about fleet yet, bearing in mind the majority of the problems with the CO2 and emissions comes from fleet vehicles. So I realize that this doesn't apply to heavy haulage, but smaller light vans, they're going to need to convert, and they will need a very reliable public charging when they get stuck.
Yeah.
And maybe I can also add something very quickly to the points that were being raised just now. So one of the things that, for example, it was mentioned that most of the charging is in 4 countries. Well, most of the market is in those countries when we look at it, absolute figures of vehicles as well. It's not just about the electric vehicles, even it's about all the figures. So it's not very fair to say that, I think, first off. And then second, it was mentioned that private charging is a big part. We've looked at data that we have, because in our association, we have DSOs, or DNOs as also known. We have CPOs, we have EMSPs, and we have quite a lot of data that we can use. And one of the pieces of data that we have is the fact that around 8% in many countries, the average is around 8% of all charging happens at home. And that's also around 80% of the total electricity being supplied at charging points. So with that being said, the importance of private charging is big. That also means you have to get buildings ready, especially in the context of fleet. As Sara mentioned, we have to think about depots, about connecting massive infrastructures to the medium voltage grid as well, not just to the low voltage grid. So really where the capacity is. We need to also think about the Trans-European network for transport, the TEN-T, because that's where we also have funding. And we can also link it to the discussion of Connecting Europe facility, where we still have a lot of funding that we don't really tap into. Actually, only 3% of the funding is used for electricity and in the context of charging infrastructure. So it's definitely we can do more when it comes to investment. And I just want to mention also that it's true that not everything is user-friendly right now. And the way to do it is to have perhaps a more open discussion about what data we share out there and how we share it. We don't want the data to be open and, potentially, victim to cyber attacks, but we also don't want to keep our data and not being able to optimize the charging process.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that is connected to that, and it's also for you, Peter, that I wanted to ask, many people bring up the problem of the grid and how especially fast charging cars will kind of put a strain on the grid, especially in cities. How do you see that problem, and do you think that if we speed up the transition to sustainable mobility in electric cars, will that be more of a problem and something that we can't keep up with, or is that something that is always brought up as a counter argument, but really like we can do it? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we need to consider that the European reality is different across countries. We have countries with stronger grids in the Nordics, for example, or even France. We have others, for example, Ireland and parts of Eastern Europe that don't have stronger grids. So those things require different solutions. And when we look at the options in front of us, there are basically 2, maybe 3 options. First option is to put a lot of copper in the ground and make the grid stronger, connect to the medium voltage grid, as I mentioned, where we have higher power rate that the vehicles can take in with fast charging. The second option, and it's a bit more of a temporary solution, is to build sort of storage facilities just next to the sites where we can optimize again the process and make sure those vehicles charge without any problem. And the third one is also going to the discussion for the low voltage grids, which we have at our homes connected. There we also need to talk about the role of the so-called local energy communities, where we enable the role of the prosumers, in a way, allowing citizens to be able to effectively use their vehicle in this context of the building as well. And this is something that right now the EU has actually legislated on in its electricity directive, and it's up to the national member states to implement. So it's not even an EU decision or like an industrial decision. It's really about member states facilitating that for their customers and their citizens effectively.
That's also an interesting topic and something that Sara brought up before the panel. So it will be important to also involve building regulation into this whole topic of sustainable mobility. So Sara, maybe you do want to be the first to talk about it because you did bring it up. How do you think we should legislate to ensure that we're building homes in a way that supports sustainable mobility?
Well, For a start, I'm not sure providing 2 spaces to park 2 cars outside a 3-bedroom family home is particularly sustainable, because that just encourages car ownership, whether it's an electric car or not. Well, we know it's going to be electric in a decade or more. But I think there should be way more interesting ideas to support homeowners. For example, if you rent in an apartment or something, perhaps there's a way that included in your rent, in the same way as your service charge and everything else, your fee accesses you almost mobility credits, something that you can choose to use either on e-mopeds or scooters or a bike or a bus pass or a car club car, whatever, but just not making, we tend to reward our car owners a lot with priority parking and discounts, or only the elite can buy the car parking space in the city centre. It seems wrong. I think we should be sharing land a lot better. And if we can build that in from the ground up, if we can encourage our home builders to see it as an advantage to selling the houses, selling the property, having this like lovely opportunity to live sustainably, which is becoming fashionable. That is something that people want from their lives, some kind of wholesome feel, then I think that would really work. But in terms of how to force them to do it, it's going to be proving the numbers. It's going to be proving that it's worth their while until we can once again whip them with some kind of legislative stick. But it shouldn't be like that. And I don't think that's what the market wants. I know, Mita, you were saying earlier about people in cities don't always need a car. I think that's fantastic. I agree with you. Lots of people are putting off getting their license for a long time because they just simply don't need to. So imagine if you are aspirational now as a teenager, looking forward to where you want to live, and you're drawn to the house that has the solar array, the ground source heat pump. It doesn't have a car parking space, but you do get £2,000 a year to spend on public transport included as part of your house purchase.
Birgitte, what do you think about it?
You probably all know about the paradigm. So first you do avoid, then you do shift, and then you do approve. So we first should be thinking not about the building, but how the buildings are positioned to each other. Because if you have buildings and you can access schools, work, shopping, I went to the dentist today, all by walking and cycling, and maybe taking a bit of public transport, then that already helps a bit in moving people out of their cars and into more sustainable and more healthy lifestyles. And only then we start talking about mobility credits and all the magnificent things that Sara was saying of what we could do. And then only at the very end you get to the electric car and how the electric car may help in the building, because I think it was Peter who was already referring to it. The car can also help to balance the grid if we develop in the future vehicle to grid technology. So there is a lot of opportunity in moving to the electric car, but we should be very careful not to replace our combustion cars just with electric cars. It has to be a more holistic thinking. And especially the developments of the neighborhoods have to be thought through. This will not always work in rural areas maybe, but in all the bigger cities and smaller cities in which 70% of Europeans live, this can work. So we have to redevelop, we have to rethink of how we position things to each other, where we build, and how we have infrastructure in between to get us where we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Mitya, you wanted to add something, and I do have the next question is already ready for you. So
this is for me.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Please. First of all, it seems that we are again focusing on people living in cities. Mobility is not only for people in cities. Other people in other areas as well need mobility and rely on it much more on their own car than others, especially if you want to be flexible. If there's a bus coming around 2 times a day in your village, you might not like to rely on the bus. Second, electric mobility. Electric cars are already more expensive than combustion engine cars. Now we're talking about, oh, well, yet now why don't you also renovate your building, your apartment, and add some electric charging infrastructure? So we add burden on the consumer. I'm not sure if this makes electric mobility even more attractive.
That's definitely true. There is this brings us a bit back to the funding gap and all the money that will have to be spent on the green transition. And I think we'll get to that a bit more later. But I do have one other question for you, Mitja, to start off. Actually, from our audience. So Celine asks on YouTube. I have a question about the argument that though the regulation is argued to be technology neutral, some say it favors electrical cars over other technology. I was wondering what your thoughts on this are. And I do want to start with Mitja because you do represent the industry.
Yes, the regulation does favor electric mobility over other powertrain system. Because of the systematic, the way the regulation is designed. So we have a target of how many grams CO2 if the fleet is allowed to emit in 2025 and 2030. And in order to calculate this, the authorities basically look what is coming out of the tailpipe of a car. And then when you take in normal combustion engine cars, they should aim for, at the moment, 95 gram, depends on the weight. Some emit more, some emit less. Most of them emit more. But then if you look at an electric car, there's no tailpipe, there's no emissions, so it's zero emission. So it's much more favorable, but I mentioned the issue of synthetic fuels. If you would use a CO2 neutral fuel in your combustion engine car, it would emit CO2. But in order to be produced, this fuel would take CO2 from the atmosphere. So it would, in the end, emit the same amount of CO2 into the atmosphere by being used in the car as it was taken from the air beforehand. So, but still, it would be not. It would emit, and in the way the regulations designed, it would be emitting car, which is not good. I think you should be much more technological neutral in this, and this not only includes internal combustion engines, but also fuel cell electric cars, hydrogen, other fuels.
Mm-hmm. So Peter, you kind of represent in this case the other side, and you will probably argue for more electric cars. What do you think about it?
No, I don't think it's about arguing for or against electric cars. I just wanted to share the example we have in our sector, because also, as you know, our sector as electricity industry, we're also subject to regulation at EU level, and that's the emission trading system. We have around 11,000 installations covered by that, which means that all the electricity generation in Europe is subject to ETS, which means that we have a cap, an absolute cap that is decreasing and will ultimately reach zero. Of course, there's still some provisions, rules, special rules, whatsoever, but the difference with us is, for example, we have also, legislation that kind of doesn't favor coal, right? It takes a lot of the coal plants out of business. And it's something that our industry has embraced because it wants to achieve the goals for the purpose of the economy, but also for its own competitiveness. And I really hope that what you just said, Mitja, and what I've discussed with a lot of your colleagues also at the SEA, is something that hopefully doesn't age that bad, because there will be usage of synthetic fuels, maybe in aviation and other places. But when we talk about passenger car transport especially, I mean, we are definitely on the verge of the electric revolution. It's happening. And if our European manufacturers are not willing to take the lead, others will. And that's what we're afraid of as well at our industry. And that's why we try to have a dialogue with the SEA, try to engage and have, put the solutions on the table. And the solutions right now for the passenger car segment seems to be electric all the way. That's just how it goes. In the next 20 years, it'll be true.
And on this topic of being left behind in a way, there's also the argument to be made that the regulation really only regulates the existing fleet of, the future fleet of cars and ignores the existing fleet of cars. So do you think that this is enough? And if rules are changing again faster than the lifespan of a car, if the rules again change next year due to the Commission working on it again, but a car lasts for 15 years, is that, how does that match together? What do you think about this way of regulating a sector that needs a lot of pre-planning? And if we want to get to net zero by 2050, I think we need to start now. So what do you think about this? Let's start with Sarah.
I was thinking as you were speaking about how we've kind of a bit deja vu. We've kind of been here before. If you remember, everyone was told, don't buy petrol, definitely buy diesel. It's definitely the better option. And then we've all gone and done that. And now it's actually stop. We need to be investing in electric. Now, I feel like there's a little bit of mistrust, or there certainly was a year ago. But finally, I feel that people, particularly here in the UK, we're getting it now. Like, we understand the need. And I think that actually the human element of that need has been very strong. And obviously, we've always cared about sustainability, and we've always cared about global warming and CO2. However, when it starts impacting people and lungs and health indices, then people do start paying a little bit more attention. So I'm particularly pleased to see the health element contributing to the electric argument, and the fact that it is quite quick to deploy. We can achieve that. So having a really strict target will only spur on a greater adoption of vehicles. And I think with electric cars, there's so much choice now. Literally 3 years ago, it felt like there wasn't. It felt like you had to drive, you know, a funny looking car or something that looked really futuristic, whereas now you can't tell one from the other. I drive an MG, actually, a little car that looks exactly like the petrol equivalent, which is fantastic. And I paid £23,000 for it, which is still way too much, but it wasn't the £35,000 I expected to pay. So things are changing, and I'm really enjoying that fact. But any policy needs to think about the how. What I really like about this legislation is it does pay attention to the fact that we need to upskill, and I want to see a lot of courses and apprenticeships coming forward, technical qualifications for people who are now teenage, who can be inspired by this electric revolution and want to be a part of it. But at the moment, there isn't a lot out there. Where's the cybersecurity courses about data? Where's the ones that show you how to fix and maintain an electric vehicle rather than an internal combustion engine? That could have happened last year. So we need pace. If we're going to meet these deadlines, then legislation will only take us so far. We need to harness this passion and set a pace that we can all get on along with.
Mitya.
Yeah, so now we again, we are not confusing, but we're mixing up two very important issues. The one is the pollutants, and the other one is the greenhouse gas emissions. And it is right. There was also car manufacturers that cheated about how efficient the diesel engine is. But we have the Euro regulation, which regulates how much pollutants are allowed to come out of the tailpipe in a car. And today, our combustion engine cars, the diesel as well as the petrol car, are as efficient, as clean as they've never been before. And now we want to take them off the road. Why not use them now and bring them on the road and take all the older cars, which are at the moment emitting, off the roads? And I think this would be helpful. Or the initial question was a bit different, right?
which is no problem. I'm really liking the dynamic that we've developed here, that we have questions coming from within, and I think we're gonna run out of time very soon. We haven't even touched on the economic aspects or the future of the regulation, which I would really like to go to. So if it's okay with you, I would actually stay with you, Mitya, because you can probably give us a lot of input on the economic side of things and the sector that is affected here, because we are talking about EU legislation, and it's easy to get lost in all in these details, but and also think about the big dream of net neutrality, but we do have to think about the economic side and all the jobs that are on the line, that could be on the line. So it isn't, the car industry makes up a big portion of European employment. So do you think the regulation does enough to protect the sector, and what else needs to be done, or what else can be done to make sure that in our quest for becoming net neutral, that we don't completely upend our economy and end up with a lot of people out of jobs? Mitya, you can go first.
Yes, thanks. I think there are different aspects that we have to take into account when we talk about the economic and the social impact. At the moment, the whole discussion we're having here today is focusing on the advantages of electric mobility. But there's a risk to it. One aspect is we don't know who will make the run. If this will be the European manufacturers in the end prevailing, or maybe Chinese manufacturers running over or taking over the lead. When it comes to internal combustion engine, the Germans and the European manufacturers are world leaders. They are the best. So we have a technological advantage over others. What we're doing now, there might be good reasons, but what we're doing now is we are putting this technological advantage at risk, and we have very high paid jobs that are fundamentally related to internal combustion engine. This is in development and research, but also on the production lines. So the manufacturing of one electric car takes only 1/3 of the manpower or woman power than you would need for manufacturing a combustion engine car. So what are we doing with these people? And the automotive industry is not only facing a transition in the powertrain, but we're also facing a transition in related to connectivity, automatization, to data. We're also facing a transition in consumer behavior. I mentioned this earlier, and now we're also facing the most an unprecedented crisis due to the social distances measures taken as a consequence of the COVID-19 crisis. Basically, this year we're expecting 20% less sales of cars in Europe. Car manufacturers were at a standstill. We didn't produce any cars, almost none cars in some of the months this year, which is unprecedented. And this all comes together now, and we also have to take into account the money that we need to invest into electric mobility and alternative powertrains. We shouldn't only look at electric mobility, also hydrogen, gas, etc., and natural gas. The money, no one earns money from selling electric cars at the moment. No one. We need the car manufacturers only get money from selling combustion engine cars. So this is their cash cows. So the transition needs to be managed in a way that is healthy for the companies as such, that they are not that they have enough money to invest in the transition, and also make sure that the workers are able to adapt to the situation. And then also take into account there are some companies that rely to 100% on the combustion engine. There's like for instance, Mahle, a supplier from Germany, 80,000 employees worldwide, basically only produces components to the combustion engine. What are we doing with those people?
That's a good question, and I'm sure no one can give a completely clear answer to this. It will be part of the development that we'll see. Birgitte, for you, money will be a big part of solving all of these issues, obviously. Now there's a big movement towards green investments, and there's so much talk about sustainable finance and all that. So how do you see, do you think the investments that are being made now are enough? Are they, sometimes some people say it's even overblown, it's not sustainable the way that green money is now being invested. Where would you say we are in terms of sustainable investment, and how can it help transition the sector into being more green?
I don't know. Have you looked recently at how our emissions were still rising just before COVID? Have you seen that the ppms are still going up? So I was listening to Mitja, and the challenge for the automotive sector is huge. But going forward as we do now is also another possibility. I've been looking quite a bit into the projections on where energy has to come from to meet goals on net zero in Europe in 2050. And we need to change profoundly. And so are we investing enough? I don't think so. Not yet. We should be doing more. But we will not only buy cars, we will install charging stations. We need to change our energy system. So yes, some companies will have to change profoundly, and especially if you have worked for years for a company and you've developed indeed the world-leading combustion engine, and you have built that for years, and that's needed less, at least. That's difficult, and you can see in the Green Deal that was proposed that the Commission is saying things about this, and that we have to find ways in repurposing people, and it will not be nice if you have worked for many years with great pride to beautiful technical products. But I really think we don't have another option. And Mitja, I think, also said that there is a fear that others than the European car manufacturers will take over. I think that fear is real, and I think with making one level of playing field, we will also be helping the car manufacturers, because if they can still rely on the old cash cows, they even have to rely on the old cash cows, because that's the level of playing field. But if everybody has to change, then at least that is the same. Of course, it's going to be a balance, and good European style, there will be a lot of negotiations on this. But if we want to have a livable planet, originally I'm a hydraulic engineer. I don't want to do only my old job in building dikes. I also want to still have a world where we have water levels at acceptable levels. So I don't want to move into a world beyond 2 degrees Celsius. And if we are not changing, we will be in that world. And that's not a nice world. And I don't want to be there. So we have to change. There is no other option.
Yeah, that's true. So I have multiple people wanting to speak. I would give the word quickly first to Sara and then to Mitja, and maybe then again Birgitte, because someone in the comments actually asked how come you moved from being an engineer to the European Investment Bank. If you can, in a few sentences say how your career progression worked, that would be, I think, interesting. So Sara, you can go first.
Oh, no, I think we need the answer to that question. Come on, let's hear it.
Okay, Birgitte, you can go first.
I still work as an engineer at the bank. So the European Investment Bank, because it's a public bank, we also have a department with engineers. So I work as an engineer, but I now work for the clean mobility side. So thinking through how we can move finance funds more to cleaner mobility. I also assess still if climate investments are resilient, where I need my old skills. And so that explains how I work as an engineer for a bank, because as a public bank, we're interested in what we invest in, and you need engineers to understand what you invest in.
So maybe you'll gain a colleague very soon, Casper, who asked the question in the comments. Definitely.
We have some vacancies.
Okay, great. Sara, you wanted to react to the previous point.
Oh, you are all genuinely so interesting. I've really so enjoyed this. The time has flown by so quickly. But I have something, Mitja, that you might like. I remember hearing at a Smart Cities conference, we were talking about cities becoming smarter and keeping traffic flowing, et cetera, freeing up road space. There was somebody from Italy there who was bringing something called Allow Air. That's the brand name for their scheme. Their scheme is that you have an energy rating on a vehicle, so an internal combustion engine vehicle, in the same way that you would a fridge or a freezer or an electrical appliance. So instead of being per milligrams per particulate, you would be rated within your category. So you have categories at the moment, and here in the UK, those categories get taxed. but one end of the category is so unbelievably vastly different to the other end of the category. And this would be a really good way of enabling that social set that can't currently afford electric mobility to maintain their vehicles, because as you said, they are some of the cleanest on the roads in history right now. So it would be much better if that person was driving a £5,000 clean car than it would a £2,000 very old, very dirty, very polluting car. So this is about incentivizing the purchase of a clean internal combustion engine, if there is such a thing. But I know what you're going to say, and I'm hoping that you thought that was a nice way to transition out, perhaps to extend that transition time. Just really intrigued to hear your thoughts on that. So it's like a rating for cars.
Mitya, go ahead.
So my first thought, it sounds very interesting. Also sounds a bit like more administration for everyone. So I'm not sure if this is easy to understand for consumers. I don't know but if you make it right, I think it could be a very useful tool. But this is just my first personal assessment.
I think it's definitely worth sharing. When this gets broadcasted, I'll add a link to it. I don't know what stage they are in their campaign, but as somebody who really rates electric vehicles and clean air, it made me think, well, maybe this is a really interesting way to bridge the gap whilst we're headed for our strict targets. Who knows?
Yeah, please share the link or the information to it. It would be very interesting. Thanks.
And Mitya, you also had a point on what Brigitte was talking about.
Yes.
In terms of investments. Yeah.
Yes, because I would like to make one thing very clear. The German Automotive Association and our companies, we are committed to achieving climate neutral transport by the mid of the century, first of all. Second, we are committed to reach the 95 targets for 2020 and 21. We also are committed to reaching the agreed targets for 2025 and 2030. So there's no one in our industry is discussing those targets. We want to achieve it. And the goals set are there, and we are thinking we are on the right track to get them. They're very, very ambitious. And some companies might not make it, not of the Germans, we make it, of course. But they are very ambitious, and I think it's very important here that we have the right policy framework in place. This means, for instance, when we take a look at electric mobility, don't only electrify the powertrain, take a look at the whole ecosystem of electric mobility. And if we really want to save the climate, then make sure that there's enough renewable energy. There's enough charging infrastructure. There is no ideological fight against the combustion engine, because if we would use synthetic fuels, it would also help the climate, because we can use synthetic fuels in the existing fleet, or it would be a great push towards using them in long haul trucks, in shipping, in aviation. So I think the right framework here is needed, so that we can fulfill the commitment that we have given.
Thank you. And we already have to get to the end, unfortunately. It's been so much fun. I can't believe that we've been talking for so long. Maybe the listeners are noticing, I hope not, but I think it's been very interesting. So thank you all for joining and adding your thoughts. We will get to the last round of questions, and I will do it again alphabetically, just so that Peter can be the first to go, because we haven't heard from you in a while. So there are two things that I want to that I would like you to comment on. The one last question from the audience, which is coming from Tammy. I often find that in these debates, the proposed solutions are very specific to certain environments. Do you know of a more comprehensive way to approach e-mobility? So is there a cure-all, I guess is what Tammy is asking. And then bringing it back to the regulation that we're talking about, do you think this regulation will achieve its goal of reducing emissions in the long term? Why or why not? And maybe you can connect this all together of the regulatory landscape that we have and what is still needed. Peter, you can go first.
Yeah, thank you also for the question. And I think if I allow myself to be a bit laconic, I can say energy efficiency to both questions, Because really, in the end of the day, what we're looking at is how to be also more energy efficient with the energy that we have. I don't think we understand energy the way that we probably should, because I've been running my computer for the last hour and the lights were on and I probably paid less than 2 cents. And it's, I think, the same with transport as well. We see quite a lot of value from, the things we use in our life, like energy, transport. And here I see also resource efficiency, absolutely. And I think what will really help us achieve our goals, in that sense, is thinking about how we efficiently use our resources. And that's on one hand. And on the other, I think we need to consider the industrial competitiveness of, of Europe in general, because we're talking about jobs, we're talking about people's lives. And sometimes it's easy to be carried away in ideological debates, but in the end of the day, it's about those two things. And that would probably bring us to a brighter future.
Thank you. Birgitte.
What is my question? Do I have a specific one?
So do you have no, it's the
Oh,
same
just a
question.
general. Okay. Yeah, what can I add? I think there is not one thing. It's really the whole field. And I think the conversation we had today only shows that, because there are so many angles to it. So I think we should not be thinking this is the biggest challenge we have faced. There's this beautiful cartoon with the COVID crisis and then the climate crisis just behind, no, then the economic crisis and then the climate crisis just behind it. It's about biggest challenge of our lifetime, and we can make that happen. And I think you were talking about the young people being inspired. I think already young people are being inspired to move into cleaner technologies. I'm not as young maybe as you. I'm in my mid-40s. I see all my friends who have worked in other spaces thinking midlife, like, okay, I want to do something better for the world. What can I do? How can I contribute that this climate change is manageable? So if everybody does that, then in the end, I think we will get there.
I hope that we convinced a couple of people watching now to go into this field, because it is very interesting and there's lots to be done. Mitja, you're up next.
I think what we could do from the point of the regulators, make sure that the whole climate, energy, transport regulation framework that is in place at the moment is working together, and we don't have just a sectoral approach to one aspect. So make them interlink, make the different sectors work together on the climate, on fighting climate change. I think this would help a lot. And we have one very interesting system already in place in the European Union. This is the emission trading system. If we would extend transport and other sectors that are not included at the moment to this system, this could also help, and also to make sure that there's emission reduction at the most cost efficient way, and there where at those points where it's needed most. And this would, I think, be a way forward for the coming years until 2050.
Okay, Sara.
Well, firstly, just thank you everyone for being so honest today and to really bearing your soul about what you think and feel. It's really helpful to everyone watching and to whoever we can share this with. But I think it really just boils down to three things for regulation to ever be successful, and that is education, communication, and collaboration. So this is about translating what's written in highly complex language into something that's basic and understandable that people want to get behind. So if you're being told that you can no longer drive, the outroar, the outcry will be horrendous because people won't understand why we're doing it. People are tired of hearing "'cause the climate." they want to understand more detail now. And I really like seeing that in our communities. So I would love more of this, more of what you're doing, Jimmy, keeping everyone talking, making sure we're all having a chance to feed into these. I know in the UK, they're very good at telling us what they're thinking about doing before they do it. We really appreciate that because business and industry can then feed back in with their views and experience and expertise. So yes, I want to see the future coming forward being inspired, and I want to see those who are here now, like us, doing everything we can at every waking moment and hour to make sure that the right change comes quickly.
Thank you. That is such a great note to end on. That it's in our hands what we do about the green transition. It might be a bit cheesy, but it is true. And I hope everyone watching, and I hope that even though you weren't able to participate in the conference this year, you're still participants, and we're still happy that you're here with us and following what we're doing. And this is such an important topic. We will have another important and very interesting topic to talk about in 2 weeks' time. So there will be another online panel discussion on contract rights in e-commerce. So you might notice that we were able to already foresee what would be the two priorities of the new commission, because we chose these topics before the new commission went into office, and we chose a topic that has to do with the European Green Deal, and we chose a topic that has to do with digitalization. So in 2 weeks, we'll talk about e-commerce and online sales on the 30th of July at 6 p.m. Strasbourg time. So same time, same place, again on YouTube. The links will be shared on our social media, so please join us again. And until then, I wish you all the best, and I thank a lot the speakers for being here today. It means a lot to us as a volunteer project to have such high level representation from the European Investment Bank, from the industry, from the VDA, from Euroelectric, and also someone who's worked so much with local governments and regulators who can give her input. I really enjoyed all of your viewpoints a lot, and this exceeded my expectations, even though I already had very high expectations. So thanks a lot, everyone, and